Tonight, Dr. Anthony Fauci says the next few weeks are critical to tamp down what he calls a disturbing coronavirus surge.
It is extremely exciting for us to get back open again.
We've got 10 states that have seen a record number of new COVID cases this week.
You see parties, people gathering on the beach, which I think is a little reckless.
It might cause a slight spike in cases, but I don't think it's any more dangerous than being outside is.
Would you say that the situation right now in Phoenix and in Arizona is dire?
Yes, it is.
People are scared.
You know, we need to get back to work.
We don't seem to have like a real plan.
They can lock me up. They do whatever they want to do. I've had it. Thank you.
Over the course of this season, we've spoken to policymakers, economists, civil rights leaders, and heads of state.
Coronavirus has just blown open systemic inequality that has been long simmering in the United States.
We've heard from experts across the US, Europe, and Latin America, as well as figures from the CDC and WHO. Now, we wanted answers to key questions about the coronavirus pandemic and the new world in which we find ourselves. Today on the season finale, we're speaking to perhaps the most qualified person on earth to answer the biggest questions about the crisis.
Thank you very much, Dr. Birx, Mr. President, Mr. Vice President.
Dr. Anthony Fauci is the nation's top infectious disease expert, and he's become a household name, standing as a rare voice of reason during the worst pandemic for a century.
We're going to continue to see things go up. We cannot be discouraged by that because the mitigation is actually working and will work.
Now, to quote Winston Churchill, we wanted to ask him, is this the end? Is this the beginning of the end? Or if indeed this is the end of the beginning? Dr. Fauci, thank you for your time today. Now, I know you're insanely busy, so I want to start with the problem writ large. In the beginning, we were seeing numbers coming from China and Southeast Asia in the tens of thousands for COVID-19 infections. And then I first looked at our estimates here in America, and they were in the millions for the US alone.
We could get in the range of 100,000 to 200,000 fatalities.
Why is it that it's seemingly China and Southeast Asia could flatten their curves, and while it was coming towards us and while we could see it, we're like, well, we can't do that, so it's going to be in the millions? How did we become the epicenter of this pandemic?
You know, it didn't actually happen that way where we said we didn't see it, therefore, throw your hands up. That's actually not the way it happened. First of all, I think you got to take it country by country. With all due respect to so many of my Chinese scientific colleagues and who we have a great deal of respect for, the transparency about numbers in China, I think you have to be careful if you extrapolate numbers and say they only have X number of cases and X number of deaths.
So they're underreporting.
Yeah, I actually have some reservations about that. But since I have no proof that there's any difference there, you have to look at what China did in the beginning that we never would be able to do in a democratic place where people have a free spirit, namely essentially just completely lock down a country. I mean, in a way that was very imposing on human rights. We'd never be able to do that in this country.
The Chinese government has imposed the most extensive lockdown the world has ever seen.
When you talk about other countries, some of the smaller Southeast Asian countries, the Taiwans, Singapore, Korea, which had a very, very localized group of infections that were easily able to be contained. I'm not saying that we did everything right, but I think when you say, oh, they had thousands, we had millions, we don't know what they're doing, I think you should compare us more to Europe.
So we're just inside Papa Giovanni Hospital, which is the biggest hospital in Bergamo at the epicenter of this crisis.
Italy is a very competent country. They have good physicians, they have very good scientists. They got hit really badly. The equivalent of even from on a head-to-head basis, sometimes even worse than we did. We got hit very badly because what happened is that we were getting inflows of cases from Europe at a time when Europe itself wasn't necessarily recognizing that they were going to be as bad as they were, particularly northern Italy. So you had at one time a substantial proportion of our cases were coming from the New York metropolitan area. There was one period a couple of months ago where almost half or more of the cases in the United States were in the New York City metropolitan area. They got hit hard unexpectedly. Does that mean they did anything wrong? I don't think so. I think it was just the circumstances of how an outbreak enters the country and how you respond to it. So I don't think you can say we knew what was going on there and we let it happen here. You've got to remember that in the beginning of the outbreak, there were claims every day that this was a very inefficiently spread virus. In fact, it was almost exclusively from animals to humans.
The CDC says the mysterious coronavirus has sickened dozens of people in Asia, with 4 new cases in China.
Now, retrospectively, it was clear that it was very efficiently spread. Then you look at what happened here. We started putting travel restrictions on really essentially before there was even a case in the United States. Then we repatriated people from Wuhan. And then we had the first, what we call travel-related case in the United States. And then we cut off travel from China. And by that time, it was clear that we were having community spread. So although it is always easy to say we could have done, and I admit we always could have done things better, I think it is a little inappropriate and unfair to say, look, they had thousands, we had millions of cases. It's very different from country to country.
Everyone seems to be doing their best to kind of keep distance.
I'm a bit worried, but I'm trying to be as careful as I can by wearing a mask and keeping my hands clean all the time. So
it's actually important right now that we try to gradually open up the economy. The question is how we do it.
So recently, the New York Times, I believe yesterday, wrote a story entitled "Coronavirus Isn't Over, but New Yorkers are acting as if it were." Many anecdotes about people partying, shopping, going to bars, partying in the streets, not social distancing. And this is from the epicenter of the disease in this country. What do you think is happening here?
I'm glad you brought that up because that's a very good point. And this is a very complex situation. So let's take the New York situation. New York got hit very badly.
So we have 10 times the problem that California is dealing with. 2,739 deaths in the state of New York.
They went into extensive mitigation. They shut things down. They had the curves go way down in a very steep curve, and they got down to a low level where they were able to appropriately use the guidelines that are checkpoints to guide you into gradually opening up. There's the gateway where you have to have a certain diminution over time. If you pass that, you go to phase 1. You do that for 14 days. If that looks good, you go to phase 2. To their credit, Governor Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio abided by the guidelines. And then all of a sudden you see in the media the picture down in the East Village of people reveling, drinking, no masks, congregating. It's the free spirit of people in the United States who understandably felt so cooped up for so long. Jobs were lost, the economy went down. So there was almost an all or none revolution saying either we're going from shutdown to all bets are off. And you note, the governor said, if that doesn't stop, we're going to bounce back to the gateway and go backwards. That's the worst possible thing we can do. There are people that are saying, why the big deal? Why are we shutting down? Why are we doing these restrictions? It doesn't bother me. I'm healthy. I'm going to be fine. 20 to 45% of the people get no symptoms at all. Some get mild symptoms. Some are in bed for weeks. Some require hospitalization. Of those, some require oxygen. Some require intensive care, and some die. So where have you ever seen that degree of disparity with the same infection? What isn't understood is that we're all part of the process of trying to contain a pandemic that is killing the vulnerable people, the elderly, those with underlying conditions. That is a very difficult communication message to get across to the American people.
The whole public communication has been bumbled and fumbled from the very start.
I think they really dropped the ball just because especially in February, they were kind of saying it wasn't real and it wasn't really going to be that serious.
The notion to tell people what to do but not to follow it, like do as I say but not as I do.
All the rules are different in all these different places. And I have my own business, and I don't even know what's like allowed and not allowed and things like that.
I don't know if they're lying again. I don't want to be this person that runs around and listens to these fucking people that I think are Nazis, you know?
Bro, you gotta wear a mask, bro.
Mask, I'm all for it. Wear them as a sign that you care for others, is how I think about it.
I never go out without a mask.
I mean, according to the doctors, he's wearing a mask. Like, I got hand sanitizer in my bag.
Yeah, like, I take all the precautions.
You said you were going to give us some wipes, so you know what I mean? Like,
it's been surprising how many people don't.
And you hear people saying that, you know, this is fake and you're not supposed to do that. And it's just this clouded message.
So I think that, you know, it seems like people think that the coronavirus threat is over because they want it to be over, which goes in the face of scientific fact. So what message would you tell those people who are flouting, you know, science and medical fact?
What I would tell them is what I'm telling you. And that's the reason why my voice sounds like it's disappearing, because I've been on so many media, podcast, interviews, speeches, trying to get that word across. And you hear a lot of things about, well, what are we going to do about the second wave? For goodness sakes, we're still in the first wave. If you look at the numbers, we're starting to see a disturbing increase in the spread among those states that early on didn't have a big burden and shut down and did not have a lot of disease. And now, as they're starting to open up, if they don't do it correctly, they're going to be very vulnerable to having the kinds of surges that we saw early on in the outbreak.
Right now, Arizona's hospital beds are at breaking point. The Arizona State Health Director recently said we are not going to be able to stop the spread, and so we can't stop living as well. That's a quote. Is this fatalism? Is this true?
Yeah, you know, there's no time for fatalism right now, quite frankly. And again, it's the communications of understanding that the dynamics of an outbreak, particularly when you have such a heterogeneity of responses, of severity, from nothing to death, ultimately, and I hope it's much sooner rather than later, the scientific achievements of interventions in the form of vaccines and therapeutics that can mitigate some of the suffering and the morbidity, that's when we'll really get our arms around this. But right now, the only thing we really have is the adherence to the public health recommendations.
If you're worried about getting, like, we're outside and we're not wearing the mask.
I am not fearful of it. I do not feel fearful of gatherings.
I don't worry about it. I don't let it get to me. Like,
Florida opened early, they refused guidelines, and last week they hit a record high of new cases and rising. What do you say to the states that seemingly are ignoring the science and the medical fact?
Well, all you do is to tell them, please look at the facts. You've ignored, or not necessarily completely ignored, but you didn't pay as strict attention to the guidelines, the guideposts, the kinds of things that we call the checkpoints before you go to the next step of opening. And this is a predictable result. It's an unfortunate result. It's not too late to contain it. And what does happen in one part of the country, ultimately, not immediately, but ultimately, it will have an impact either positively or negatively. So I try to keep in as understandable terms as possible why we have a responsibility to do that.
On May 12th, you said, quote, "My concern is that you will start to see little spikes that will turn into outbreaks," end quote. Are we seeing that now?
I think we are in the states that you mentioned. We're seeing situations where some states, literally within the past couple of weeks, have surpassed anything they've had previously. We're seeing some states that are even having trouble keeping up with the hospitalizations. So you can't hide from it. It's there.
So your boss at the White House, Vice President Pence, said in an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, which was titled, "There Isn't a Coronavirus Second Wave," end quote. He said, and I'll quote him, "The truth is, whatever the media says, our whole of America approach has been a success," end quote. Actually, there's been a rise in 20 states, all of which opened earlier. What is the truth, A? And B, has this issue become highly politicized?
Well, I mean, obviously, we have such political divisiveness in the country that's unprecedented. It makes the response to something as serious as a public health pandemic all the more difficult. Nonetheless, we need to continue to go by the facts, and we need to recognize it when we see it. So we need to do something about what's going on in those states. We absolutely do. And the way to do that is right now to try and contain as best as possible, get the resources there that are capable of doing the identification, isolation, and contact tracing. That's what needs to be done right now. And hopefully, as a lesson, that when you have communicable diseases with no ability to intervene other than physical separation, as stressful as that can be, that's the way you contain it until you can gradually and prudently open up. And I must mention, when you do it carefully, you will see cases. There's no doubt, because whenever you pull back on mitigation, you'll see cases. If you handle the occurrence of those cases in an effective way, the manpower, the system, the test to do identification, isolation, and contact tracing, you could be able to prevent these little breakthroughs, as they go, from becoming a serious surge in infections.
Donald Trump said that he thought that the testing was a joke.
When you do testing to that extent, you're going to find more people, you're going to find more cases. So I said to my people, slow the testing down, please.
I mean, I'm a supporter, but I think that was a stupid statement to make.
Maybe the government wants us to think that not to go out and stay inside to stop the protests, but I mean, I'm gonna keep going out, so I don't care, you know?
We just feel like we want to come out here as much as we can to show support.
Dr. Fauci telling us to stay indoors. I feel like we've been indoors long enough, and as long as we're out and we're being safe and conscious and protecting ourselves, my belief is that we should be safe.
So there's been a lot of protests over the country the last 3 weeks to a month. A lot of epidemiologists are worried about those protests causing spikes, if not outbreaks. For example, President Trump is having a rally in Oklahoma, which you said, as an at-risk person, I'm not going to go to. Is having political rallies and protests exacerbating this problem?
Yeah, when you have a situation where there are viral dynamics and infections going on in the community, and you congregate in crowds, you are increasing the risk of being infected and of transmitting infection. This is particularly true if you don't wear a mask. Now, we know that things like people demonstrating for things that they feel strongly about, for issues of social injustice, which are very valid, whatever you're congregating for, and you don't pay attention to physical distancing, you're increasing the risk of infection. If that is the case, which is not optimal, but if it is the case, the least you can do is to consistently wear a mask. And when dynamics of where you are leads to a lot of animation, a lot of chanting, a lot of screaming, please don't tempt yourself to pull your mask down. Leave your mask on, because we know from scientific studies that when you shout or when you sing or when you do it, you have aerosols that go out. Best game, don't go to a crowded place. Second best, wear a mask if you do and you feel compelled to do it.
I just don't think this is over. You're going to see maybe a little decrease in the summer, but I think it's going to come back in the fall with a vengeance.
To go back to the macro, the last pandemic of this size was the Spanish influenza in 1918. Sort of followed the same loose pattern, started here, went down to the southern hemisphere, came back with a vengeance in the autumn. And I know you said, look, we're in the middle of a first wave, why are we talking about a second wave? But the reason why everyone's asking about a second wave, if it comes back and we have to shut down again, what is the official, stance on that?
Yeah, no, you know what I think is that the second wave that people are talking about, why do we assume that it's going to be worse than the first wave? You're talking historically about what happened in 1918. This is in many respects different from that. As I've always said, hopefully we'll have therapeutic interventions in the fall. It's doubtful that we will have a vaccine that we feel comfortable is safe and effective in the fall. We might have it by the end of the year, December or January. But what you can do is, as I've said, if you handle the return of infections as we get into the winter months, which might happen, that you do it in a way that effectively prevents it from becoming a surge. If you're prepared to put the public health effort of truly trying to contain it before you have to mitigate. There's a difference between that for people to understand. Containment means you could stop it from exploding. Mitigate, it's exploded. What are you going to do about it? That's the point. If you can prevent the latter and keep it at the former, there's no inevitability of having a worse wave in the winter if we do something about it.
Dr. Fauci, thank you for your time today.
Good to be with you. Thank you for having me.